Welcome back to CLI's Legalpreneurs Spotlight Future 50 series. In this series, we're showcasing thought leaders and doers in legal innovation and legal tech around the world. Today, I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Uwais Iqbal. He is the founder of Simplexico, which is a legal AI consultancy dedicated to serving the AI, machine learning, and natural language processing needs of the legal sector. He's based in the UK. Uwais has a background as a machine learning engineer, a data scientist, and now, of course, his own consultancy. We're going to get into how he came into the legal world in just a moment, but a bit more about what we're chatting about today first. Our topic is AI beyond the hype in legal. So we're definitely going to be doing some serious myth busting in this session, and I really can't wait. I am so looking forward to this discussion. A huge welcome to CLI in this series. It's fabulous to have you, and thank you so much for joining us so early in your day. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure and an honor.
It is our pleasure, truly. I've got to kick off by jumping right into your journey and why it landed in legal, and I'm really fascinated by this in so many different ways. Because, you know, if you think about AI and the legal industry, you kind of almost think of them as being, you know, opposites. And so you could have gone and applied your amazing skills in any industry. Why did you choose legal?
I think it was more a case of not me choosing legal, but legal tech choosing me. So the legal tech life doesn't. So you don't choose the legal tech life. The legal tech life chooses you in some ways. Yeah. So my background, my journey, I started out doing physics at university, and after that, I was really interested in technology. So I just happened to kind of find myself in a role at Eigen Technologies, and when they were very early on as a startup, they were focusing on the legal sector. So as with any startup, you get thrown into the deep end, and they were moving into machine learning. So I had to learn a lot on the ground, practically, of what it means to do machine learning in industry. And then I moved on to Thomson Reuters, where I was in the innovation lab. We had lots of fun. Thomson Reuters has tons and tons of data as an industry giant, and we worked with an amazing team. And then after that, I moved over to Salt River, again, kind of exploring NLP within the contract space. And then at some point, I had a realization, or kind of a thought, that I was a little frustrated with how technology was being done at legal tech startups. And I thought there could be a better way of provisioning technology to kind of serve some of these use cases and needs that are common within the legal industry. And that kind of idea and frustration led to kind of the birth of Simplexico. And what we're doing is we're looking to be kind of, as you have legal service providers where people go to for the provision of legal services, we're looking to be a legal AI service provider. So anybody in the legal industry who's interested in developing or kind of deploying AI solutions, then we're interested in collaborating and working with them.
Absolutely fantastic. And congratulations, by the way, on not just the idea and concept, but actually bringing it to life. I know that the work that you do and that you've just explained is really about and focused on making AI accessible, you know, understood and used and applied and all of those things. And, you know, we first connected through the amazing publishings that you've been doing on, you know, things like LinkedIn. And so I wanted to, with that kind of background in mind, wanted to ask your thoughts on a few things. And the first one is, and it's one that comes up often, and I'm sure you've answered it many times before, but where do you think AI is in terms of legal and on the hype cycle today? And I'm thinking, you know, is it more promise than reality? So we're doing some myth busting here for a second as well. Sure. Or do you think it's coming into its own, or, you know, where is it? Where does it sit?
So I'm guessing you've come across like the Gartner hype cycle. I think that's kind of a good way of...
Yes, it's a good way, isn't it? Yeah.
It's a good way of like grounding the discussion. So I think we've kind of gone through the peak of like disillusionment, or the peak of hype. And then I think we're coming down the slope of disillusionment. And I think that for a couple of reasons, because within the industry, you see there's a proliferation of AI vendors. everyone within like legal tech seems to be doing AI in some way, shape, or form. But then lawyers are still doing their job as they usually do. So these tools exist within the market, but then there's issues around implementation, there's issues around adoption of those tools. So I think that the hype has definitely happened. This whole narrative of AI replacing lawyers fueled, I think, the first wave of AI within legal. But now I think we're coming down that curve of inflated expectations, and there has been some disillusionment. I've certainly spoken and met some people who said we've used an AI tool, it's not really kind of helped us in any way, and as a result they've ended up dismissing the entire technology of AI and what it can possibly kind of bring to the legal space. So I think there are some kind of unfortunate casualties of the inflated expectations. But what's interesting, and what I find is interesting, is that once you're down the slope of disillusionment, you kind of come into the trough of despair, then the productivity plateau. I'm interested in kind of thinking about how do we get to that productivity plateau faster, and overstep some of these kind of like traditional this traditional paradigm of how hype cycles normally work. And especially within the legal industry, it's I don't know why, but AI isn't as hyped in other industries. And I'm not sure kind of what the reasons behind that is today, but there definitely has been more kind of promise than delivery. But when it comes to a technology like AI, I think there's a certain inevitability about it. So just as with like computers, there was an inevitability that when they came about very early on, that at some point they were going to enter into our personal and professional lives, whether we kind of liked it or not. So it was more a question of how did we kind of embed computing devices within our personal and professional lives and use them in the most effective way possible. So on the one hand, you can take a position where you kind of ignore AI, but then it might be too late for a firm or an organization because the rest of the industry has kind of taken the benefits of what AI can bring. But then on the other hand, I think an interesting perspective to take is that AI is an inevitability that will get to the plateau of productivity sooner or later. And it's a question of how do we become more mature in thinking about adopting this new technology, which we kind of know a little bit about, but we don't know kind of a lot about how to do it well within the legal industry. And then once we try and answer that question of how do we do it well within the legal industry, I think that's when AI can have kind of a real and lasting impact, bringing value to people doing work in the legal space.
Yeah, absolutely, because it then becomes kind of integrated into the thought process about everything, doesn't it? Give us some examples of some AI tools for folks that are just listening and thinking, what would be something that I can understand in terms of an AI tool?
Sure. AI tends to get spoken about with like vague terms, in very vague terms. So AI is this magical solution or this magical technology will somehow help you solve all of your problems. I think it's more effective to ground the discussion in terms of actions. So AI in some ways is a way of capturing and scaling expertise. And then what we normally do in our professions or in our work is that we have jobs to be done. So for example, I have a job to be done of getting from home to work. At some point in time that I could only do that job by walking or riding a horse, for example. But now with the advent of new technology, I can get that job done using public transport, using a train, using a bicycle, using a car. So once you frame it from that perspective, AI can do a handful of actions at the moment. So we've kind of filtered them down to maybe, I think, 5 or 6. One is around extracting information. So how do you go from unstructured data, a set of contracts, to a structured set of fields that you can then use for some sort of analytics or some sort of business insights? So one action AI can do is around the extraction of information. Another action AI can perform is around comparing pieces of text. So when drafting a contract, for example, you'll have to compare a drafted clause against a playbook standard. So that kind of comparison action can be done by an AI tool. And then a third action AI can do is around labeling documents. So typically within a law firm, everything gets labeled against a predefined taxonomy. Within the knowledge management space, I guess there are people whose kind of entire job is to maintain that taxonomy and make sure that information gets organized properly. AI can help organize information by tagging documents, by tagging clauses. And then AI can also perform the action of helping people to find relevant information or searching for relevant information. So there are kind of AI tools which perform those actions, some better than others. But I think framing the discussions in terms of speaking about the actions AI can perform grounds the discussion, because then you can see where it actually relates, or where it can actually be embedded within kind of a larger legal workflow.
Absolutely. You touched on benefits, and I was wondering if we could kind of address that, head on. What are the benefits that you see of AI in legal, particularly?
Sure. So I think there's the obvious benefits that with AI, there will be some kind of degree of automation, and then that obviously will bring down costs, and then costs for legal services will become cheaper. And I think alongside that, one aspect is AI creating time. So a time that would usually be spent doing busy manual work can then be kind of redeployed more strategically to do more kind of higher level, meaningful kind of work. So I think AI can help reduce costs, but adjacent to that, it can help create time. And with the way lawyers work, time is probably the most valuable commodity they have, the most valuable resource they have. I think alongside that, AI can help lawyers give better advice and be more confident in the advice they give. So, for example, in a litigation scenario, if a legal team have to process through millions and millions of documents, if they have to do that through a manual endeavor, there's going to be a point where, after reading so many documents, fatigue just kicks in. They might miss certain things, or they might overlook certain document sets because they might not be relevant. Like immediately, they might not be relevant, but beyond kind of initial search, there might be relevant things. So situations like that, where there's a high volume of data or information involved, I think AI can help lawyers give better advice and be more confident in the advice they're giving. And another interesting benefit of AI I came across, which came up in conversation with a lawyer, was around talent retention. So there's a big kind of problem within the legal industry at the moment. I think within the UK, I'm not sure within other geographies, but lots of newly qualified lawyers and associates who've been within the legal profession for a few years end up leaving law firms. So law firms have an issue with talent retention. And then I think that relates to the quality of work that these people are experiencing. They're having to do lots of manual labor that's not very enjoyable, and it's very kind of mindless work. They have to kind of read through documents, extract information. They have to read through cases, etc. So I think AI can help introduce a better quality of work by allowing people to go from kind of like soulless mental labor and transition to more kind of soulful, meaningful work. And then when that better quality of work is realized, then that should improve talent retention. I think within the UK, we've seen the starting salaries for newly qualified lawyers skyrocket. And that's because of there not being enough kind of fresh graduates interested in coming into the legal space. So there are issues around how do we continue kind of the pipeline of talent coming into law firms, but then also how do we make sure that they're staying within the job because they find it interesting and meaningful, rather than something tedious and not enjoyable. And like beyond that, a wider social benefit of AI is around the access to justice piece, which I think is one of the main kind of components of this, is that as legal services become cheaper, as lawyers have better quality of work, the cost to access legal services should come down. And then through that, we should see more people being able to access justice who previously weren't able to, because of the high costs and the issues involved with that.
And I guess some of the products, for example, that AI is an integral part of, can also be turned from the inside out, right? Which then increases access to a whole bunch of hopefully helpful filtered information for clients as well, and that improves the access to justice aspect as well. So
yeah, so there's I guess this is one of the difficulties with the legal industry, is that everybody's very protective over their information and their data. But I think one of the interesting things about AI is that the more kind of open data is available, or the more resources that are shared within the ecosystem and within the industry, I think that will be kind of a push towards having kind of a larger social impact, especially on the access to justice piece.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me ask you a question kind of on the flip side now. So we've looked at benefits, but to also kind of, I guess, focus for a second on the dangers, and unfortunately, probably the first place that people often go. And I'm thinking particularly here on some concerns that have been expressed and probably more frequently recently about how, too little time is being spent on that intersection between ethics and AI. And I guess we've seen some AI being used as a decision-making aid that has been based on biased data. And so there's criticisms about what it produces at the end of the day. What are your thoughts about that? And I guess more generally about those dangers, if any?
I think the dangers are important, and it's interesting because, like, we've seen headlines where AI models have kind of gone off the rails and done kind of dangerous things. So I like to think about it in like three main areas. One is around liability. So if the AI model gets something wrong, so if the self-driving car makes a mistake, or this like litigation AI who's responsible for giving judgments gets something wrong, then who takes responsibility? Who's liable for that? And then within like the legal industry, that's even more kind of precarious because of the risk involved in giving advice to clients. This affects people's lives. This has like a big impact on kind of people and how they live their lives. So then the question arises that who's responsible if an AI model gets something wrong? I think it's an open question, but there are kind of, alongside the dangers, I think there are ways to mitigate these risks. That in sensitive scenarios where AI is helping with decision making in a way where it can have negative consequences if something goes wrong, then I think there's like almost an obligation to try and stipulate some minimum level of human interaction or assurance. So just like we have kind of systems for quality control and quality assurance, then systems for like decision control and decision assurance, so that if something goes wrong, there is at least like some kind of human intervention or human oversight for the decision making that takes place. I think these are open questions, and I don't think anybody's kind of like nailed this just yet. But as the field develops, I think we'll see more interesting things coming around. So another kind of common danger around AI, which you just touched upon, is around bias. So the AI models are trained using the data we collect, and then the data we collect is a representation of like the reality we live in. But as humans, we don't tend to collect data on everything, or the representation of reality we have through our data is skewed. And as AI models become trained on that data, they also have a skewed understanding, or they take on those biases that we have as humans. And the danger with AI models is that one of the main functions is around scaling expertise and scaling decision making. So if the bias is baked into an AI model, then that decision-making bias is scaled in a way where it can impact potentially thousands or millions of individuals. If bias is within humans, if we have bias, then it's restricted to the decision-making powers of an individual. But within AI, once these systems are deployed, then it can have an impact on thousands and millions of people. There was an interesting story a couple of years back with Apple. They launched an AI system which helped them determine whether or not individuals were applicable for a credit card. And that system, there were headlines about it a couple of years back, but that system was heavily biased against women because of the data that had been collected. And solely on the person's gender, women were discriminated against in their loan applications, so they were unable to access the finance they needed. So there's issues with bias actually taking place in the real world, and I guess we'll come to speak about it later. But GPT-3 and BERT are kind of very big models which have attracted a lot of attention. They suffer from issues around bias. For example, BERT is known to have issues around gender bias, and then GPT-3. There were articles around it where GPT-3 is kind of inherently Islamophobic because of the data it was trained on from social media. So these AI models tend to pick up these biases which are present like within the internet or within the data we train them on. But in terms of how do we mitigate that, I think there's questions around how do we be more conscious of the data we collect and aggregate. But then also when it comes to training the AI models, how do we be selective about what data we use to train the AI models so that we're able to filter for biases, or we're able within like the design of these models to try and mitigate that risk. So like a second kind of danger is around bias, but I think there are ways around it. And another area is around trust. And I think especially within the legal space, trust is quite important, because if an AI model gives a suggestion of a litigation outcome, for example, or it suggests that this clause is risky within a contract, then how can we trust what the AI models are doing? And for AI to be adopted more widely within the legal space, I think this is a key issue that we have to try and like tackle and address. That how can we design and build the systems and the interactions with AI in a way where we can maximize the trust? So is it just a case of the AI model just giving its predictions, giving its suggestions, or are there things where we can do around getting the AI model to show its workings out so that we can peek inside the brain of the model and see what it's doing? So there's a whole family of models and an area of research around explainable AI. And that draws on how do we kind of build AI models in a way that they can that trust is baked into the interaction with the models. And it can be something as simple as if a model thinks a certain clause is risky, then identifying kind of the phrases of language which create that risk within that clause. So I think although there are dangers within AI, there are ways to mitigate them. But the question is around when it comes to the design before the actual implementation and deployment of these models. In the design phase, how do we design to mitigate these risks and mitigate these dangers, so that the way we do AI is a responsible and a sustainable way to do AI? Because the last thing we want to happen is that through the hype cycle, AI systems are deployed, and through these dangers not being mitigated, negative consequences come about as a result. And then we end up in this trough of disillusionment, and it takes us time to build up that trust again and come back to the productivity plateau.
Yeah, absolutely. And, as I was listening to you, I was thinking, given how, and I guess going back to a comment that you made earlier, given how pervasive AI could become, it's just critically important that people engage in some knowledge and understanding of this. They don't have to be experts, because they can come to your consultancy for that, but they do need to understand that there are these kind of issues or questions that need to be addressed. It's almost having to approach some of this with a bit of a forensic mentality or mindset, I guess, to understand, as you say, what's behind the door in terms of the working. So just so critically important. You mentioned GPT-3, so let's jump in and go there. There's been a flurry of activity on this, I would say, in the media at the moment. And for folks that don't know what it is, I just kind of want to take a step back and just explain first what it is, but then I want to get into how you realistically see that impacting the legal industry in the next short while. So first bit first, what is GPT-3? And presumably there was a GPT-1 and 2 before 3 as well, right?
Sure. So before I jump into GPT-3, I just wanted to add on to a comment you just mentioned about
of course,
at least having some level of surface understanding about AI, the goings on behind the models. I think it's interesting because you can have understandings at different levels.
Yes.
On the one hand, I think it's important that we at least have a functional understanding of AI, and I think this should apply to everybody, regardless of like you're in the legal industry or not. Just as you have like a functional understanding of how to use a computer or a mobile phone, you know how to use your smartphone, right? Yeah. But then you don't necessarily have an expert understanding, that you don't really know about the goings on in your laptop, or how the how the routers connect to each other and send information on the internet, but you're still able to access and interact with it and understand how to use it. So I think with AI, as the technology becomes more and more pervasive, it's important that we develop a functional understanding. And this is kind of why we've started doing the work we have in terms of demystifying AI, that the sooner we can get to a place where people have a good functional understanding, not based on marketing hype, but based on a reality of what this technology can and can't do, then we can start getting into like interesting discussions of where this technology can be used. So I think as a base, everybody should have a functional understanding, and then as people become more and more interested, or like anybody who's interested can always go and find out more about AI and go deeper into it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So on a functional level, GPT-3 is an AI model developed by OpenAI. It's what we call a language model, and a language model is a model which effectively learns how to fill in the blanks of a piece of text. So if you've ever used a language learning app, there's always these exercises where you have to like fill in so there's a sentence and it might have a couple of gaps, and you have to like fill in the words for that as you learn the language. So that kind of intuition of how we learn languages was used in the design of training this model. So what they did is they took kind of billions of examples from the internet, and they created these kind of fill in the missing gaps exercises for the model to do. And over that process, it learned about language, it learned how to generate language, and it learned kind of the general structures within language. So there has been a lot of hype around GPT-3. There was a GPT-1 and a GPT-2. So these were previous generations of the model. But the current generation is on GPT-3. And I think only last week there was ChatGPT-3, which was made open as like part of their research initiative. And like social media and the internet have been flooded with examples of how this chatbot can generate meaningful text, which on some levels is quite impressive. With GPT-3, it's important to keep in mind like the size and the sheer scale of the model. So models, the way models tend to work is they're made up of numbers, which tell them which each of these numbers is kind of like a decision maker within the model. Okay. And GPT-3 has 175 billion of those numbers.
My goodness.
Or parameters of those decision makers. So just in terms of the sheer scale, GPT-3 is one of the largest AI models that have ever been developed. So it's a feat of like human engineering and ingenuity that we can actually have a model like that.
Just absolutely incredible. And then so taking that, because I know I've seen also, because obviously I'm probably tapped into the legal industry, right? So I'm seeing various people try this out in the industry. And so how do you or do you, I guess, see it unfolding in the legal industry, and whatever time parameter also you think that you're likely to be speaking to?
So I think it's important to understand that with any AI model, I think it's always good to question what data it was trained on. And the majority of the data that GPT-3 was trained on was data available publicly on the internet. And a few other data sets were thrown into the mix. So the type of language that GPT-3 is kind of very familiar with is mostly internet text. That's not to say it's kind of like somehow like at least a little bit familiar with legal text, because there are some kind of pockets of that on the internet.
Mm.
But the GPT-3, it's known as a generative model. And that means it's a model which can generate text. So you feed it a question, or you feed it a prompt, the model ingests that and it starts generating text in accordance to the prompt you gave it. So I think GPT-3, on the one hand, it can be used within the legal industry, and I think over maybe the next, I think I've already seen a few kind of legal tech startups deploying, like using GPT-3 in some of their work. But I think over the next few years, we'll see more and more kind of use cases where GPT-3 is being used. But those use cases will always be around the generation of text. So if you think back to like the AI actions we spoke about earlier, within the legal space, this would involve jobs like, or actions like drafting clauses, for example, or summarizing a collection of cases, or answering questions, etc. So I think GPT-3 can help in those areas. But the interesting thing is that if you have a model like GPT-3 and its capabilities, and then within a law firm you have lots of kind of data which has been collected over time. The interesting thing which gets me thinking is that if a law firm was to like fine tune or take up GPT-3 on their own data, then what would that look like, or what kind of things would GPT-3, like the legal version of GPT-3, be able to do? Because GPT-3 has been trained mostly on internet text, and not kind of completely looking at legal data. But then if you had a capability like GPT-3, and then you advance it by training it on legal domain specific data, what applications could it power, and where can it kind of develop the improvements? So GPT-3 is it's a general model which tries to seek to learn language in a generic way. So it needs lots of data, and it needs billions of parameters, and it needs millions of dollars in order to be trained to do this. So the question is that if we kind of narrow the domain and we narrow the scope, can we make these models more efficient? Do they need less data? And then can they be trained with less money? And I think within the legal industry, we're not there yet to explore those types of questions. But I think those types of questions are really interesting because on the one hand, a lot of the development in AI is driven by research labs. So you have, I guess, two main contexts for AI. One is like the research context, where you have teams like GPT, where you have companies like OpenAI and Facebook, etc., and Google pushing kind of the envelope on what AI can do in a very general way. And then those advancements and those kind of technologies end up trickling down to industry. And that process usually takes a couple of years, where those models are then kind of customized or realized in industry applications. And within the research context, these models and these kind of research agendas are always very general and very generic. They're looking for solutions which can try and do everything, which can try and kind of tackle all types of questions, all types of text, work on all types of data. The question, like at least I'm interested in exploring, is what happens if you like shift the paradigm or reverse the paradigm and say that rather than starting from like a generic premise that we want to work with all data, all language, and do everything, what if we start within a legal industry context or any industry context and have the premise around more specific scenarios, that how can we develop models to do this based on the use case at hand? So there's common use cases around like classification against taxonomies for knowledge management, but there's not a lot of research around that, and there's not a lot of models which have been developed specifically for that kind of use case. So I think if we're able to kind of like shift the paradigm, rather than like research labs driving the development of AI for kind of generic abstract use cases, shifting the paradigm to say, if we're able to focus on industry use cases, How can we kind of feed back to the research community and say, hey, these are interesting problems that you should be thinking about and looking at, because they can have huge impacts, not within the industry, but also on a social level. That if you're able to do AI well in a legal industry, then that could have like huge social impacts for people being able to access law, and people being able to use the law for what they need.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're absolutely right. I mean, it's been difficult, I think, to deploy this within legal because, you know, as with most professions, there's a lot of jargon, there's a lot of very specific terminology that means something, and it has to be used very carefully. But there's also, as you again pointed to, the fact that law firms often have their own particular version of, for example, a contract. And there has been a reasonably recent move towards standardizing some contracts globally. But it very often the case is that you have what looks to be a very similar contract, but a law firm has its own particular way of expressing a clause or its own contract. And that's, you know, those things don't work well in terms of how the model is currently operating. So it would be great to see that become more industry focused.
Yeah, so, I think it's like within the research world, everything's open, everything's accessible. So the data needs to be open and accessible. But then as soon as you step into an industry context, everything's kind of siloed behind corporations, because that's their kind of intellectual capital. So then, like, how do you navigate that cultural difference of open access versus closed access in a way where you can still bring AI in a meaningful way, so it can help people in their day-to-day work?
Absolutely. And particularly if your mindset is that the closed access is what actually differentiates you in the market. That's because that's another layer to kind of overcome, isn't it?
Yeah.
So let me jump to my last question for you. And unfortunately, I do have to wrap. But I'm just thinking in really practical terms, and I guess drawing on your consultancy, but your background that we spoke about at the beginning of this session, where do you see AI kind of having the most impact in legal? And it's really hard to pick a time frame here. So let me say in the next 2 to 3 years, but feel free to tell me that it's a longer or shorter time frame as the case may be.
Yeah, so I'll probably say this openly, that AI, there's lots of headlines and narratives around AI replacing lawyers. I don't think that will happen. I think those narratives and headlines are sensational, and they don't really draw on an understanding of what AI actually is and what it can do. So when you say what sort of AI, I think I translate that to what actions will AI help to perform in the legal space. And I think it's around those kind of 4 or 5 actions I discussed. So extracting information, labeling information perhaps against taxonomies, and comparing information, finding relevant information, as well as we see more generative models being used, drafting, summarizing, and answering questions. So I think we'll see AI being used for those actions over the next few years. But I think what we'll see now, as in like with the first wave of AI solutions we've seen in the legal space, the users or the legal professionals had to come to the tools. Like they had to learn an entire new workflow. They had to kind of change how they were originally doing things and learn how to use a new platform. And that experience is quite jarring, which meant the adoption rates were low. If they've been trained to do something one way for 10, 15 years, it's difficult to expect them to change overnight to a new way of working. So I think what we'll see over the next few years is that AI will still focus on these areas, these jobs or these actions within the legal space, but that the tools will come to the users, or will find the users where they already are. So we've already seen this where tools which are basically extensions in Microsoft Word, and they have AI enabled within them, that people are using those tools where people are using AI where they usually are actually doing the work. So I think we'll see more examples of those where AI is embedded within extensions, within plugins, or even within legal workflow tools, rather than separate platforms where people have to kind of shift data across, relearn how to do something, and then shift data back, and then go back to the usual workflows. So I think we'll see more integration. And then I think we'll also see more use cases around the generative models with kind of GPT-3 as well as ChatGPT, which have kind of become more and more popular over time.
Fantastic. I love what you're doing at Simplexico. I just, the orientation, really kind of making AI accessible. Really, I just think it's so important for all the reasons that we've just discussed.
Yeah.
So congrats again. It's been amazing chatting with you. Thanks again.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks. A pleasure.